So imagine my surprise after just having written and recorded the points I had come to on the presuppositional apologetic, that in looking for a specific soundbite I wanted to use to underscore a point I was making, and remembering a friend of mine here on YouTube sending me something featuring Sproul on the Presuppositional months earlier, that I searched for his response to it on YouTube and heard him say the following. Not only are the ideas of what he speaks virtually congruent to my own realizations concerning the thing, but even his language in certain instances. I'm not saying this in any way to toot my own horn, so to speak, but rather it is evidence to me of the working of the Spirit, which I believe will lead believers into all truth, just as Scripture makes clear, if we follow its guiding into Scripture, rather than relying solely on man-made interpretation for our ideas and conduct and faith and practice. I think it is important for believers who may otherwise be tempted to go with the flow and be swept along by the modern movement and popularity of this apologetic, which, it must be noted, demonstrates that a lack of individual critical thought is not merely constrained to unbelieving circles. Christians are not immune either. Certainly not yours truly in many instances, as I've had to clean a fair share of egg off my face over the years, even and perhaps especially after coming to Christ. To see, while some atheists have hinted at its shortcomings, it is Christians who have made the best and most reasoned critique of this approach, and that far from being dishonoring to God, to be non-presuppositional in the modern context of what that means. In one's apologetic, the case can and is quite ably made that it is extremely lacking to attribute to the God of logic an apologetic which is quite demonstrably illogical and would pervert perspective so that the adherent must assume the virtual idolatry of God consciousness rather than to recognize his created role as the creation whose chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I understand that's frank talk, and I welcome any and all rebuttals no matter how harsh in their criticism. The last thing I would want is for people to take my word on something simply because I espoused it as fact. See for yourself. Challenge yourself. Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. Instead of merely including just a soundbite as was my original intent, I'm going to upload fair bits of what Sproul says with links to the originals below for those wishing to see the entirety of these presentations. God bless.
Dr. Sproul, after Dr. Meyer's talk back here in the room, you mentioned, boy, that's great apologetics. And there's a question here asking an apologetical method question. Can you explain the difference between presuppositional and classical apologetics? And maybe elaborate on what you meant by even Dr. Meyer's talk and how you thought that was a well-presented apologetical argument within a framework of the different schools of thought of approaching apologetics.
There are different schools of thought with respect to apologetics. I can think of at least three right off the bat. There's presuppositionalism, and there are different schools of that. There's axiomatic presuppositionalism that follows Gordon Clark, and then there's the other presuppositionalist school that follows Cornelius Van Til. And then there's the second approach to apologetics, which is called evidentialism, and then the third view that I espouse, which is called classical view of apologetics. There are lots of differences, Chris, and it would be unfair to try to define them absolutely in the short term, but the fundamental differences in presuppositional apologetics argues this way, that the only way you can come to a sound conclusion of the existence of God is that you must begin with the assertion of God's existence. You must presuppose the existence of God in order to have a sound argument for the existence of God. Evidentialism sees that as circular, which, of course, they don't have that critique of presuppositions being circular in its reasoning process is not something that one must prove or display because, for example, in Van Til's defense of presuppositional apologetics, he not only admits, in fact, he wouldn't like the word admit, but he agrees that it is circular, but he says in defense of that the nature of all argument is circular, that the starting points and the conclusions are all bound up one with another. And what he means by that, I see two problems with that. One is if you admit that your method of proving the existence of God is circular and commits the petit principia fallacy in logic, that you've already surrendered the rationality of your position. And you've given the unbeliever an excuse to reject your position because you have made a logical violation in the process. Well, Van Til acknowledges circular reasoning, but he defends it by saying, as I mentioned, that it's a particular type of circular reasoning. And in this case, he commits a second informal fallacy, the one of equivocation, because the meaning of the term circular changes in the argument. He could have just as easily said that all arguments are by nature linear, that if I start with a rational starting point and I'm come to a rational conclusion, that's not circularity, that's linearity. It's the same thing if I begin with an empirical premise and come to an empirical conclusion. I've just remained consistent with my methodology, and there's no sin in that. The problem with against that, evidentialism says that we present concrete empirical evidence for the existence of God, arguing from nature and so on, and also from history and the like, and that will give you a probability quotient of conclusion that would satisfy even somebody like David Hume in terms of the astronomical probability quotient that you achieve. But that even those arguments based on empirical investigation and so on, and inferences drawn from them, will not get you to formal certainty, that can only be arrived at through a logical proof that is irrefutable. But classical apologetics say that the case for the existence of God can be proven demonstrably, rationally, and formally, and compellingly. So it's a little stronger than evidentialists, who are more empirically oriented. But what I said afterwards was that that's the way apologetics ought to be done. You don't just say to the scientific community, well, you're working on the wrong presuppositions or you have the wrong worldview. That's true. But you have to begin to show them that the conclusions that they've drawn from their own evidence are formally invalid, which is what I heard this morning, and I thought it was magnificent.
One follow-up question is, how do we explain why classical apologetics is not equated with rationalism?
That's to me again? How do I answer the charge that it's well, you know, if I espouse to be human, that doesn't mean I've embraced humanism. If I argue that I exist, that doesn't mean that I am an advocate of existentialism. And just because a woman is feminine does not make her a feminist. All right? We want to be rational. To be rational is to think in a sound way. And to be rational does not mean you embrace rationalism. And at the same time, you have to understand that historically, in the field of philosophical inquiry, there have been three distinct types of rationalism. Cartesian rationalism, where rationalism is distinguished from empiricism, where the highest proof is found in the a priori categories of the mind rather than a posteriori demonstrations empirically. In that debate between the 17th and 18th century, the second form of rationalism is the form you found in the Enlightenment, where the rationalism was distinguished not from empiricism, but from revelation, where reason was elevated above the trustworthiness of supernatural revelation. Then the third kind of rationalism is the Hegelian rationalism in the 19th century, where reason is elevated to the capital R, where it is the highest reality, where reason itself becomes God. So when you call me a rationalist, I want to know what kind of rationalist you're calling me, and I would deny all three of those, and would say I'm just trying to be rational. I hope that answers it. The alternative to that is everything outside the category of the rational is what? Irrational. Yeah, we don't want that.
But before we get to the classical view, let me mention
another approach to apologetics, which has become the overwhelming majority report within Reformed theology. And that is the view of apologetics known as presuppositional apologetics. There's more than one variety of it. There's axiomatic presuppositionalism that was championed by Gordon Clark, but the more popular view of presuppositionalism is that was developed by Cornelius Van Til, late of Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, where he labored for several decades, and who has published much in this field, and who was indeed a genuine giant and titan of the Christian faith. The book that I co-authored with John Gerstner and Lindsay, we entitled Classical Apologetics, includes in 1/3 of that book a comprehensive critique of presuppositionalism. So because of that book that Art Lindsley and John Gerstner and I authored, we have become engaged in ongoing dialogue within the Reformed camp with respect to what is the preferred approach to doing apologetics. And Dr. Van Til, having written in the English language, which was not his native tongue, he was a native of Holland, sometimes writes in a style that is somewhat difficult to follow, and because of that, not only do his critics differ among themselves as to what he was actually saying, but also some of his most noteworthy students differ in how they interpret him. Some of his students interpret Van Til as a fideist, whereas I think his most able interpreter, the late Gregory Bahnsen, did not see Van Til as a fideist, but saw him arguing a rational case for the existence of God.